I know this video is not necessarily the one you guys voted for, but I just need to vent here, and don't worry, I will cover these movies quite a bit in this video. Anyway, I don't know about you guys, but whenever I talk about movies and shows released from the past few years, I often get this kind of response. Oh, these new movies and shows nowadays are just not as great as they used to be. This is an example of nostalgia bias. And after rambling about my favorite stories and getting the same old argument from people, I've had enough of it. And I just want to make it very clear why this line is such a stupid way of thinking and how it ruins media discourse for everyone, including those making the BS argument. Now, to be clear, I have no problem with nostalgia in general. I acknowledge that there are some things from the past that I believe are just that good, and there hasn't been anything else that recaptures that same magic and/or improves it. I mean, I've made this point before with the Despicable Me franchise, for example. SpongeBob is another example I can think of that I believe was really good back in the old days of the early 2000s. In fact, I'm willing to say that with Nickelodeon generally, but that's a video for another time. With Pixar, I definitely look back in their 2000s era quite fondly, with their movies at the time solidifying my appreciation for animation at a young age. I'm willing to admit that even my current phase of Pixar appreciation is partly fueled by my nostalgia for the studio back when they did make masterpieces like The Incredibles, WALL-E, and so on. So without a doubt, nostalgia has affected my beliefs and wishes for the media I watch. And I assume most of you have that as well. But being nostalgic can be bad when it comes to actually remembering the past accurately. Most people like to bury their bad memories in the back of their minds, and they end up only remembering their positive experience of a certain time, thus leading to this skewed perception. We end up looking at the past with a false sense of positivity, and if you compare that nostalgia-filtered past with what you see now, which doesn't get the same treatment, what you see now looks kind of bad in comparison. This bias has ruined so many discussions because of how close-minded people can be. The prime example that I can think of, at least in the animated movie world, is with Pixar's most recent films. While these movies have their devoted fans, I have seen more hate towards them compared to Pixar's earlier original films. Admittedly, even I sort of fell into that same line of thinking. I never outright hated these films, but I initially thought they didn't hit as hard compared to the Pixar movies I watched as a kid. But when I watched the earlier Pixar films again recently, and compared them to the newer ones, I realized that actually, they're roughly on par in quality, albeit for different reasons. The earlier Pixar films definitely brought something new and unique at the time, but so did their recent films. I mean, Soul, for example, is the Pixar film, at least in my view, that really does target a much older demographic compared to what they usually appeal to. Sure, kids can enjoy it too, like with all of their earlier films, but Soul's message and how they deliver it definitely seems to target those who have experienced a good amount of life already, but haven't found satisfaction in themselves yet. Bottom line, it's likely the most mature movie Pixar has made to date. Now, admittedly, Luca doesn't appear to have the same mature themes as Soul, but overall, it's still a very solid film about acceptance, and it goes through the emotional roller coaster that is common in most of these films. Also, it's probably the first Pixar film that has gay undertones, but Disney doesn't want you to see that, so let's move on. Turning Red was also rather unique for its time compared to other Pixar films. Sure, it's not the first Pixar movie that's about the struggles of a mother-daughter relationship where at least one of the characters turns into a furry animal, but this movie is unique with its implementation of certain animation styles and how it tackles the issue of female puberty. Also, I don't know if this is a hot take, but I actually think Turning Red addressed the issue of puberty better than Inside Out 2 for the female demographics. While Inside Out 2 was able to capture how the mind evolves during puberty very well for the general audience, Turning Red addressed the issue better from the physical body is changing perspective, especially for females, which make up like half of the world's population. Then there's Elemental, which is actually my second favorite original Pixar movie that has come out in recent years. Out of all of them, this is probably the most visually complex film they have ever animated, and that alone, people should give props for. Also, it's not common that we get love stories from Pixar, and Elemental was a fairly good one, albeit somewhat predictable, but I still enjoyed it for the most part. But the best part about this movie was how it is a story about immigrants. As someone who was an immigrant and eventually became a citizen, I heavily relate to the story here. Growing up under the care of strict but loving parents and having the pressure to fulfill a dream that you and your parents have but may not share is something that I relate to so much. In fact, What I appreciate most about the recent Pixar movies is that they are all stories based on the director's personal experiences. That's something I feel like these recent movies do better than the earlier films from the 2000s era. I mean, Toy Story, Finding Nemo, The Incredibles, and others may just be great overall films because they are fun stories that anyone can enjoy at face value, but Luca, Turning Red, and Elemental do that while also highlighting the lives of people who were not represented properly in movies until recently. Again, Luca is kind of a gay allegory about acceptance. Turning Red is about teenage girls and how they adapt to change with their bodies and family relationships. Finally, Elemental is about immigrant life and how one finds passion in the world. These are stories that not everyone can universally relate to, admittedly, but there are still literally billions of people who can relate, and they can finally be represented in the media. Now, I can go on and on about the praise for these movies, but unfortunately, lots of the haters will still dismiss these arguments and still think they are not as good as the classic films because of whatever reason they pull from their ass. To be fair, if someone makes constructive criticism where they make arguments that respect the work put into these films, then that's fine. But if the reason why you think the newer films suck is because they don't give you the same feelings as the old ones when you rewatch them, then I'm sorry, but you shouldn't be taken seriously. I see this especially in the cartoon sector of the animation community. As some of you might know, I am a huge fan of Amphibia, and I've made my case numerous times for why I love that show so much. But despite the fandom being relatively isolated for the most part, other parts of the animation community decide to invade our little bubble and needlessly trash the show and make people angry. Again, there are legitimate criticisms you can make against the show, and I've made those points before, but the most recent wave of hate against Amphibia and the modern cartoons broadly just stems down to, you guessed it, nostalgia. And it's blind nostalgia, which is arguably the worst because all they do is see a few seconds of an out-of-context clip and call the entire show a ripoff or whitewashed version of some older, much more popular cartoon or anime without any further elaboration, cognitive thought, or basis of reality. Now, if only two, maybe several people did this, then okay, let them remain miserable idiots. But the sad truth is that at least thousands of people agreed with this sentiment. And these thousands of miserable idiots have a voice online and can influence others who may be more open-minded to not watch the show as a result of it. The annoying reality is that negative opinions spread wildly and are adopted more frequently than positive ones. It's why the discussions around news and especially politics are so negative and miserable all the time. The irony about all of this is that much of the negativity we have towards modern shows, movies, media, and the world largely stems down to our glorification of the past. This is what I mean by nostalgia ruining things for everyone, including the people making the disingenuous arguments. Being overly nostalgic really does nothing for you but prevent you from appreciating the things we have right now. It also just prevents people from accepting the impending changes that are going to happen as generations pass and new ideas are formed. This new upcoming waves of sequels are one of the clearest symptoms of nostalgia brain rot. Movie studios like Disney are so hell-bent on making sequels and remakes because they know they can gain a short-term profit off of the nostalgia of people who are not open to new stories, which unfortunately make up most of the general audience. Sure, sequels in general are not a bad thing if the creator of a story genuinely believes it can be extended and adapted to modern times, then I have no problem with it. But sequels are not inherently better than new, original films, and they should not be treated as such. The truth is that what we have today, especially with our shows and movies, are still great. They are just different compared to what you are used to seeing. That is not to say we shouldn't look back at the past and admire the great things about it. Remembering the great things about the past is important as it can be used as inspiration to improve ourselves and our creations. I mean, some of the best parts of new shows, for example, are the homages to the older shows that preceded them. At the same time, creators can use these positive experiences from their past to form new experiences for the next generation. Hence why we had this wave of personal stories in the media over the past few years. But you have to look at the past objectively in order to do that, which means looking back at all the mistakes we have made. As much as people believe movies like The Incredibles are perfect, they're not. When you acknowledge that the past is just as great and flawed as the present, but in different ways, then you'd be able to appreciate the gift of today. That is why it is called the present after all. But if you somehow watched all the way through this video and you're still not convinced that the new recent movies and shows are worth watching, okay fine, feel free to be miserable as you long for a time that will never come back. But personally, I'm actually happy with most of the new shows and movies I discovered over the past few years. I look forward to seeing more new stories in the near future, while I look back at the previous great films I grew up watching and admire just how far animation has come. But of course, these are just my thoughts on nostalgia and how it affects our perception of everything. If you have anything else to add to the topic, feel free to write those thoughts in the comments below, and please give this video a like, and subscribe for more content like this. With all that said, thank you all for watching this video. I hope you all have a great day. See you in the next one.